right. Well, welcome. Hello, Jeff. Thank you for tuning in. Mary Jane also, and Carolyn, John. John, you have to, so that's why we're here. So I just wanted to introduce myself and our program. This will be a program that is part of the Wild Ones National Nonprofit Organization. My name is Lisa Otis, and I am the president of a local chapter, the Menomonee River Area Wild Ones. As a national nonprofit, we have many chapters. We've increased our membership over the past couple of years. A lot of people have been very interested in landscaping and gardening. And our organization promotes the sustainability, the biodiversity, habitat restoration, habitat protection of native habitats, and basically the idea of planting native plants. We would like to see everyone put a little bit of that into their yard. So we're trying to make a change, make a difference 1 yard at a time to get those native plants out into yards so that it can provide food, shelter for our pollinators, our insects, our animals, our humans. It all goes around. So as a local chapter, we have monthly programs. As a member of Wild Ones, you have certain benefits, and that is programs, webinars, though a lot of webinars, including ours, is free and will be posted to YouTube. National Wild Ones, which is actually the headquarters are in Neenah, Wisconsin. They are doing webinars left and right. And actually tonight they are showing a webinar, free webinar, featuring Neil DeBow, who is Prairie Nursery, one of the best native plant nurseries in the state of Wisconsin. So I think they kind of trumped us. We had scheduled our date first, and then they, I guess, thought it would be a good idea to do it tonight. Good news is that our program will be taped and it will be posted on YouTube. And the national webinar will also be recorded and available for viewing after tonight. So a couple of really good things on a cold winter day to take a look at. So our chapter, I think since we don't have a lot of our chapter here, business meeting is going to be very, very short. I just wanted to emphasize that on our website, which is Menomonee River Area wildones.org, you'll find links to our programs. You'll find descriptions of our monthly programs. You'll find links to our YouTube page, which has 2 years of programs that we've been recording during this whole pandemic. And a lot of them are really, I gotta say, pretty good. Very, very fun and lots of good information and ideas. Also, you can, I think there's a link to Facebook, isn't there, John, I believe. So check out our website. We're updating it on a regular basis. So three things actually. Two things are, we are looking for a treasurer and we are looking for a secretary. The positions are pretty easy. You know, we're a friendly group and just want to try to maintain some organization. Treasurer, you know, the main thing is taking care of our chapter finances, our checkbook, making sure that speaker fees are paid, that you're tracking payments coming in. So pretty easy. And then there's a year-end financial report that needs to be completed. National Wild Ones does supply that report, that template. And then our secretary, you know, attend board meetings, take notes, supply summaries and information to board members. You know, that's really where it starts. Any of these positions can be very, very simple, very easy, or if you have time to put more into it, wonderful. Because if we don't have people participating, then we can't put on programs, we can't do the things that we want to do and that we should be able to do. So please, if you can volunteer for this year, that would be great. If it's just a 1 year commitment, that works, or if you want to stay on, that may work as well. But we are looking for those 2 positions. We also have a, oh good, here's a list of what's on our website actually of our programs coming up. a benefit of being a member again is we do hold a native plant sale the whole month of June. All members receive 40% off of their purchases through the whole month. We also do have a seed and treat exchange at the end of the year, and that is a members only event. Everyone brings some seeds from their yards, seeds they've collected, and then we do an exchange, kind of a social, a year-end chapter meeting. It's a lot of fun. So those are a couple of benefits. And while I'm saying that, I do want to mention also that National, if you're a member of Wild Ones, they produce a quarterly newsletter, which is really nice. They've won awards for the quality of that newspapers or that newsletter. All right, so I wanted to talk about one other thing. Actually, a member that's online right now, Mary Jane, has volunteered to work on a project, and I think she'd like to tell us a little bit about that. And Mary Jane, if you go lower left, you can unmute yourself. Hit the microphone.
Thank you.
Yeah, there we go.
Thanks, Lisa.
You're welcome.
Greetings all, and thank you, Lisa, for the opportunity to share. The idea has kind of doing some kind of outreach has been kind of percolating in the back of my head for a while now. It's my thought to connect our mission of habitat restoration, sustainability, that kind of each one reach one yard at a time. And I was looking for a little bit larger way to do that, and how could we take the education we're gaining and share that with others. And my thought or thinking on this is to identify a community park where we could set up a series of activities, maybe start small, one the first year or maybe a couple, and reach out to local groups that might be using the park, youth groups, adult groups, and create an activity where they could do some learning and build on that. It would be such that in the beginning, it might be simple habitat restoration of the park, or then move on to actually habitat installation at the park, identify some needs. We talked about several parks at the board meeting, and one I was able to contact fairly quickly, Lisbon Community Park. We've been there as a group a couple times, and they were very open, very receptive, invited us to one of their board meetings in March. So I'd like to not spearhead this all by myself. I think more heads are better than one. And so I'm welcoming any members who would like to be part of the steering committee for this group, and then just put it in the back of the rest of our heads that something like this will be coming up. Target time would be to have an activity in June, and be looking for that an opportunity to share what you know and learn with others.
Well, thank you, Mary Jane. Yes, thank you for bringing this up and taking action on it. We have lots of good ideas, and the thing is ideas are ideas until someone takes some action and makes that first step. So thank you very much. And we do, as I mentioned, have another member that got approval to add a pollinator garden in one of the city parks in the town of Wauwatosa. So I think that relying on her experience can help guide us to other projects like that. So thank you very much. And Jeff, you're our one member audience. So if you'd like to volunteer for all of these things, feel free. Okay, so we have programs coming up in March. We are going to be looking at some slimy wigglers here. We're going to look at invasive jumping worms, which is a really serious topic, and something that I think is definitely an interest of any gardener in the area, and trying to identify and eradicate if you have them, or identify, don't spread them. We'll learn more about that in March. So we do have tonight, though, Mellisa Curran talking about native orchid restoration. Mellisa is an environmentalist science with Stantec Consulting Services, specializing in botanical surveys and restoration ecology. Over the last 15 years, She has completed numerous natural resource assessments, rare plant surveys, and restoration projects throughout the Midwest. She has documented dozens of new rare plant populations and is currently working on reintroducing native rare orchid species to a state natural area in Wisconsin. Her collaboration with River Edge Nature Center allows the public an opportunity to participate in the orchid reintroduction process. Yes, I didn't even realize we had so many native orchids till I went to Door County and checked out an area up there. But if you'll please welcome Mellisa, and we'll let you take it away. Thank you, Mellisa.
Great, thank you. That was a great initial slide that you had. You guys mentioned Randy Powers. I actually think he took both those photos.
Oh yeah.
Yep. So he is helping me at a site down in southern Wisconsin. So just to clarify, can everyone see my screen?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. So this is really I consider this project sort of a passion project of mine. And really, I view myself as the champion. This is an incredibly long-term project, very complicated to implement. There's a lot that we just frankly don't know and a lot that we're learning. And projects like that really require, in my opinion, a champion. So I'm one team member of a very large team of people that are trying to better understand how we can reintroduce and conserve native orchid species, particularly the terrestrial kind. And I'll talk a little bit about the difference between our terrestrial orchids and our epiphytic orchids. But really there's just, for the most part, orchid conservation has been in the realm of the hobbyist, several retired people that propagate orchids in their basement. And up until recently, there really hasn't been a very, research focused effort. So I'm happy to see where this project is going. But really, in my mind, this is a community project. I love, what Wild Ones does. I love the focus on native species, and it really takes a community, in my opinion, to really conserve these species. So this photo that you're looking at is one of our first large orchid reintroduction projects we did up at the Ridges Sanctuary up in Door County. So I wonder, Lisa, if that's where you went when you saw the native orchids. Yep, the Ridges is really kind of known as a hotspot, and that's really where this started for me. But now I've expanded to other sites across Wisconsin, which has been really rewarding. So I wanted to talk a little bit about orchid diversity. So the pictures that you're seeing, unfortunately, none of these are North American orchid species, although I wish they were. But I just wanted to show the kind of the diversity and floral morphology that you see. So up in the top right, that's not photoshopped. That is called the monkey face orchid. It's just amazing to me how they can diversify. In the center is what's called the flying duck orchid. So just another, very, very intricate flower. And then of course, the two lower ones on the left and the right, those really mimic the pollinator that it's trying to attract. So again, it's just amazing to me that the orchid diversity, the orchid family is the largest, the most widespread, and the most diverse family of flowering plants that we have. So it's, there's a lot of, not really quite sure exactly how many species we have, but they suspect anywhere between 22 and 25,000 different species of orchids. So huge variation. And they have a really complicated life cycle. So orchid seeds, they're essentially like floating DNA. They're like dust. In an orchid capsule, that's the structure that encases the seeds, holds thousands, maybe even tens of thousands of seeds. And unlike like corn, for example, that has a really big seed and it has a large endosperm that it can, take advantage of that stored reserve for the new young seedling that germinates. Orchid seed doesn't have that. So it can germinate on its own, but it needs an association with a fungi in the soil to be able to sustain itself long term. Because again, it has no reserve to be able to help it survive shortly after germination. So the fungal partner in the orchid seedling can survive sometimes for years, we suspect, underground in the soil before you even see photosynthetic leaves that come up. So it's completely dependent on that fungi. And it's really in the early stages, it's almost parasitic on the fungi. But then when the plant is larger, it has photosynthetic leaves, it has large roots, the fungi partner still lives inside the roots and the orchid, and then it's maybe more of a mutualistic relationship. So it's very interesting how it's formed these sort of association with different groups. And they have very specialized pollination. So as you can see, in some of these pictures, it's really mimicking very specific pollinators that it requires. And one of our local species that we have here in Wisconsin, the Eastern Prairie Fringed Orchid, requires pollination by a very specific hawk moth. So again, some of these things make the orchid species incredibly vulnerable to eradication, just because of how specialized they are. They are deceptive. For the most part, orchids don't offer any nectar to the pollinators. More often than not, they trick the pollinators. So I'll talk, you'll see some of our local orchid species next. Some of the lady slippers have a big pouch, and the insect, it's usually a little a bee of some sort or a wasp, actually, thinks they need to go into the pouch to get the nectar, but then they can't find their way out except by going to the back of the flower structure and therefore picking up some of the pollen on their way out. But for the most part, insects can't find their way out. So you actually see a lot of dead insects in those pouches. And so so essentially the flower structure forces the insect to exit a certain way, and therefore picking up the pollen. So again, no nectar, it just tricks it. And another thing I really love about orchid diversity, or orchids in general, is they have a really high profile in our human society. So there's been books written about orchids. There's people, there's orchid societies. So it's a really great way to talk about larger habitat restoration through orchids. And that's really where I focus my project on, is getting the public to engage in orchid restoration. And there in turn, we end up conserving some of our native habitats. So these are photos of our orchid species that are specific to the Midwest. So several of them that you see here are in the lady slipper family. And can you see my cursor as I'm moving around? Okay, great. So down here is the Eastern Prairie Fringed Orchid. So not a lady slipper species, but this one is a lady slipper. This is called the Ramshead lady slipper. Up in Door County at the Ridges is kind of known for their Ramshead lady slipper populations. This is the pink lady slipper. It's actually the state flower of Minnesota. Pink lady slipper, white lady slipper, yellow lady slipper. So great diversity that we have here in the Midwest. So I wanted to talk a little bit about certain orchid species, just to sort of give you an understanding of where they're located and what their ecological preference is and some of their threats. So as I mentioned, this is the showy lady slipper. In Wisconsin, it's actually incredibly hard to find suitable populations of this species when I was looking for trying to find some good seed sources. So down in southern Wisconsin, you see this very rarely in like Cedarburg Bog. Northern Wisconsin certainly has more populations, but this distribution map, so you can see the green, the light green here is where it's native and not rare. So it's a little more abundant. So certainly Michigan has some good populations, Minnesota, and Minnesota, in fact, it grows so commonly in the roadside ditch, it's just frequently mowed down with all the other vegetation of roadside ditches. But in Wisconsin, these counties that they show in yellow, there's probably very few populations. And in fact, I would go so far as to say a lot of these counties probably have no viable populations. It's a very, very hard one to find. And in part, that's because of habitat changes, not only from habitat structure, but also hydrology, because this species does like their feet wet. But also deer herbivory is especially bad for this species. And I'll move on to the Ramshead lady slipper. And this is one of the first lady slippers that I started working with. It's one of the smallest lady slippers. So if you haven't met this one before, when you see it for the first time, you generally will say, oh, that's really small, because the picture is a little deceptive, but it is definitely a really, really small orchid. And this is a very particular habitat. It's a mixed conifer forest. And so again, up in the cool forests up in Door County is where you would typically see this species. It's one of the earliest, and it's actually state listed. So in Wisconsin, there's it's actually legally protected. And so this distribution map, you can see it's by far a northern North American species, specifically Northeast North America, but in Wisconsin, again, it is listed as imperiled. So you do see it a little more commonly in Michigan, but still not very common at all. Eastern Prairie Fringed Orchid. This is another one I wanted to talk about because it is a federally listed species. So this one, like some of the other species, has a very particular habitat requirement. It's high quality mesic prairies, sedge meadows, bogs. So again, you see it in Cedarburg Bog, sort of in your area. It is listed at the state and federal level. Very, very small populations. And I mentioned this is one that has a very specific pollinator, the night flying hawk moth, because it has a very long spur tube right here that you can see. So it requires a moth with a very long tongue to be able to get all the way down there. And looking at this distribution map, so really, in everywhere it occurs, it's considered rare. So in Wisconsin, you do see it in southern Wisconsin, but again, I'm talking about population. Some of these records have maybe a few populations and they're pretty actively monitored. So there really are very, very few populations where I would consider the collective population to be sustainable. Most of them, for the most part, you know, a population that just has 10 plants is really, in my opinion, not sustainable long-term. So this is certainly one that a lot of people are actively working on. I think I have one more to talk about. This is the lesser prairie fringed orchid, and it also grows in fairly wet habitats. It is a little more abundant than the other purple fringed or other fringed orchids. And it's one that I'm actively working with at my partner nonprofit River Edge because they have a pretty nice population there. But you can see it really is, again, a Northeast North America population. It does get a little rare down here, but that's mostly just because that's part of its southern range. But it is where it has suitable habitat and where it exists, it's typically, the populations are pretty sustainable in Wisconsin. So I mentioned this is a community project, and this is really just a snapshot of all the partners that are helping to contribute to this project. I deliberately put volunteers kind of right in the center because in my mind, this is, like I said, a community project, and I want the community to be involved in a project like this to the extent that they can. One of my main partners is the Minnesota Landscape Arboretum. So they do all of the propagation for me. I'll talk a little bit about the propagation process, but it's really done in a lab using tissue culture techniques. There are a few universities that are also contributing. River Edge is the home of, I'll call it the public facing home of this project. So this is where, you know, just the general public can go and learn about orchids. They can see them growing in a shade house, and I'll show you some examples here. But lots of partners are contributing. So I'll talk a little bit about the purpose and need for a project like this. And again, this is a project I've been working on for over 10 years now. And it's really born out of, you know, I have a background in botany, so it's really born out of a love of plants, and in particular, the diversity in the orchid family. But in my mind, they're indicators of ecosystem health. So if we lose orchids in a habitat, generally it's an indicator that something's wrong. And half of the species, as I mentioned, are at risk of extinction. So, and that's due in part to habitat loss. Habitat change, that includes invasive species, canopy cover changes, so a change in, you know, the tree species or density of invasive shrubs. Unauthorized collection is certainly a factor. In fact, you know, decades ago, they used to harvest orchids by the truckloads. So I think before we knew better, we certainly did a lot of damage to populations just from over collection. And then predation, predominantly deer, are impacting our populations of orchids. And so really this is a project where there's a local group, including myself and all the partners, that are really leading the charge on trying to understand how to propagate these species, and then how to cultivate them, not only in a shade house, but also how to get them back out into native habitats. And I'll talk a little bit about the steps to do that. And there are a few nationally recognized institutions that are working on this, and that includes the Minnesota Landscape Arboretum that I mentioned, and then also the Smithsonian has a complementary orchid project, and theirs is really focused on seed banking. So they want to collect a lot of seed because they realize that a lot of species are dwindling from our habitat. So they want to make sure that there's a reserve of seed. And then they're also trying to identify the fungal partner. And that includes collecting root samples from existing orchid populations, sending them to the Smithsonian, and then they try and isolate the orchid species. And if they can isolate it, they can do DNA analysis to hopefully identify the orchid. And of course, the purpose and need is to increase the community involvement in projects like this. So we spend a lot of time identifying and documenting orchid populations, and I'll talk a little bit about that later here. We spend a lot of time trying to figure out the optimal pollination and seed collection procedures. So there's a lot of lessons learned about the need to go around and hand pollinate, and I have some pictures later that will show you. Generally, the lady slipper species, because as I mentioned, they trick their pollinators. So when the pollinators learn that they don't get any nectar from these plants, they tend to avoid them. So there are a lot of cases where these orchid, specifically the lady slipper orchids, are not pollinating themselves. So if I need to collect seed to be sent to a lab to work on propagation, I need to ensure that I have good seed, and that requires me to go and hand pollinate in the spring. And that's actually what you see here down below. So this is me hand pollinating Ramshead lady slipper up at the Ridges Sanctuary. And again, you can see how small it is. You can barely see the flower. And then this again is up at the Ridges Sanctuary pollinating the Showy lady slipper. And because we know the Showy lady slipper is so susceptible to herbivory, we have to fence it. So when we invest that much time to find the plants and to hand pollinate them, and I'll talk a little bit about how we hand pollinate it, we better be sure we protect it so that we invest our time, we protect our resources and the time we invested in that. And of course, part of this project is to support some of those regional seed collection and long-term storage efforts that I mentioned with the Smithsonian and the Minnesota Landscape Arboretum. And there's a lot we don't know about the fungal partner. So in part, again, that's why we're running around collecting samples. And this is at the river edge. This is the purple fringed orchid roots. So what we do is we essentially, cut off one of the larger, fleshier white roots that you see here, and we send it to labs. And seed packet studies, we tried this initially without much success, but this is something the Smithsonian recommended. And so years ago we tried it, but you essentially put seed in these little packets here, and then you bury them in the ground near where existing orchids live. And what we're trying to do is essentially capture the propagation. So in theory, the fungal partner will work its way through this mesh, germinate one of the seeds that are in here, excuse me, and then we can harvest this packet and be able to capture a really, really young seedling, because we suspect that orchids may be partnering with a different fungal partner at this very, very early stage than this adult stage. So if we can identify who they're partnering with at the early propagation stage, that can help us with our propagation protocols, because there are actually a lot of species where we've had no success propagating in using tissue culture techniques. So, but still, it's a very, very young field. So these are, again, I mentioned that we're partnering mostly with Minnesota Landscape Arboretum. So these are just different stages of the propagation process, and I do have some additional photos, but typically it starts in this test tube stage where you put essentially just a bunch of seed in this test tube, and what you're seeing is sort of just a nutrient auger, like a gel-like medium that the seed is placed on, and this gel-like medium has different concentrations of nutrients at the new seedling may need. And when they get to about this size and when they start to differentiate between shoot and root, so some of the lighter sections here are the shoot of the plant, and then the darker yellow are the root structures. So once they grow to about this size, they'll typically be taken out of this test tube and put in a larger jar, and so that they can grow a little bigger and, you know, have enough room to grow actual leaves. But this is just the early stage, and we do this typically in these little test tubes because, again, oftentimes there isn't a lot of success in the propagation process, so we start small and can work our way bigger. And this is a massive Ramshead lady slipper orchids. It's about 400 orchids. This is how they used to come delivered to me, as in a bag with just a bunch of seedlings, and then I'd have to kind of tease these apart before we would put them in the ground. And part of this project is to better understand not only how to propagate them, but then how to get the orchid seedlings successfully back out into the landscape. And there are a lot of orchid species, specifically the lady slippers, that require an extended care in a nursery setting. In fact, 3 to 4 years in a nursery setting before they're large enough to be planted out in the native habitat, or what we call outplanting. The Ramshead lady slipper is a little different. That seems to have okay success. And when I mean okay success, I'm typically talking about 10 to 20% survivability when you put them out just from that seedling stage right out into native habitat. And to be able to quantify our success rate, some of the initial outplanting that we did, we established a grid system so that we could keep track of the location of where we were putting the orchid seedling in sort of an XY grid system. And then we could go back years later and be able to find that exact plant, know how old it is, and then collect some information about it's not only its survivability, but its size. So we do a lot of measuring of the leaves. And this is primarily all volunteer led. Again, we want the community to be involved in this. So there were a number of happy people that were able to help me put, I think this planting that we did was about 1,500 Ramshead lady slipper orchids. So it was a great event. And then again, we conduct this long-term monitoring so we can monitor the survivability. I mentioned that some of the orchid species require this long-term care. So this is actually a shade house that we constructed at River Edge Nature Center. And this is one of the first shade house plantings that we did back in 2019. So essentially we just put the orchid seedling in these little pots, and then we care for them for years until they're of suitable size, and then we put them out in native habitats. So this is just a few photos of our first shade house planting event that we did, again at River Edge. It was back in 2019, and the intent is to do these shade house plantings every year. Of course, COVID threw a little bit of a wrench in our schedule as of the last couple of years, but this is just me providing a tutorial to the volunteers on the process for putting the orchid seedlings in the pots. It's just another photo of we develop our own potting medium, so each orchid species has a different sort of mix, and so that was all pre-made for the volunteers, and then they just had to put it in the individual pots. This is how more recently the orchid seedlings are provided to me. So from the test tube that we saw earlier, they go into a larger container like this, and it's sealed. And again, it has this nutrient auger at the bottom, but it's more space to allow the orchid seedling to grow larger. So in a container like this, typically there's anywhere from 20 seedlings to I've seen upwards of 100 or more seedlings in a container like this, but you can barely see through the container. But these are the plants right here. And yep, so what they do is the volunteers, when we're doing our outplanting, essentially just open the container, and then they sort of tease the orchids apart, and then each seedling gets their own pot. And this is again photos from our May 17th planting event. Again, more photos. We sort of had an assembly line process going. There were a few of my colleagues that attended, but primarily everything was set up for the volunteers when they came, and the job was just to work with the seedlings and put them in the pots. Watering, definitely important to water after we put them in the pots. And this is again the finished product. This was again the first year that we had planted in the shade house. And this is a couple weeks after the planting event, so you can see how they're all growing. So back in 2019, we planted almost 950 of the pink lady slipper orchids, and then about 135 of the white lady slipper orchids. So the intent is every year we get new orchid species, and every year we're doing these community planting events. And then over time, when we have seedlings that are large enough, then we'll actually host events where volunteers can actually plant in native habitats. And the intent is to make these available for free. So if we've got native habitats that we're restoring, because this is a research project and we're trying to get the community engaged, we're trying to learn, these orchids are given to me for free from the Minnesota Landscape Arboretum. So therefore we're giving them away to free as well for suitable sites. And then this is another planting event we did in 2021. So we skipped 2020, unfortunately, and that was because there was a lot of uncertainty in the spring of 2020 on what we could and couldn't do. So unfortunately, we had to skip that year, and that did set us back a little bit. But then we engaged a smaller group in 2021. So this is actually a lot of my colleagues at Stantec. We do a community day every year. And because, again, we weren't really opening this up to the public, it was primarily just a Stantec event. So it worked out great. We were able to get all the species planted that we wanted to, and that was about 350 of the pink lady slippers and 100 of the white lady slippers. So it wasn't really open to the community, and I hope to get back to that sometime really soon. But I have a few more pictures of the process. So this is the special medium that we make for each individual orchid species. And then here's the little seedlings that you can see growing here. And it's a pretty casual event. You just, sit at a picnic table and plant the orchids. This is them in the shade house after we're done planting. Some of my colleagues, and there were two, this was an intern for River Edge, so we did include some River Edge staff as well. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the hand pollination process, because that is a very important stage. So again, I need to ensure that I get really good seed to start the propagation process. So that's really an initial first important step. And these are just snapshots of the orchids that we are regularly hand pollinating. And that's typically me running around to all of these different populations. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about how we do this. So I use very sophisticated tools here. This is a toothpick. And essentially what this is a zoomed in photo of the orchid structure for just the lady slipper orchids. So they all have different structures and they're all different, but this is the one that's a little easier. So lady slippers have pollen sacs called pollinia. So there's one, and that's the male portion. So here's one male pollen sac here. And then on the other side is another male pollen sac. And so essentially what we do is we take a toothpick and we peel that pollen sac off of the orchid flower. And this is me trying to get it off here. And then this here is showing the toothpick, and the little pollinia is just stuck at the top of the toothpick. And they are really sticky. So if you can get the toothpick in there just right, they generally come off pretty quick. And then you take that toothpick with the pollinia and you walk over to a different orchid and you put it on the stigmatic surface right here. So this kind of hard, flat surface, you just stick it right on there. And that's really it. So it takes a little bit of, eye-hand coordination and some steady hands, but it is, can be pretty labor intensive. You have to, make sure you have a suitable size population where you can cross-pollinate enough plants. And typically I try to pollinate at least up to 10 plants. I don't always collect 10 capsules worth, but at least I get a fairly good amount so that I can have enough seed come fall. And then I'll have to return to these populations and collect the seed when before that they get too crispy in the fall. We don't want them to break open. So I wanted to talk a little bit about, this is an example of the need to hand pollinate. So this is the Eastern Prairie Fringed Orchid. And because I mentioned earlier that this is pollinated by the night hawk moth, and because that moth population is so low, oftentimes this species goes completely unpollinated. So this is an example of where it has multiple flowers on one long stalk, and we keep track of which ones we pollinated so that we can make sure we collect the right one. But it's also just good information to know in case there's any mishaps. But this is I think a week and a half to 2 weeks after we pollinated, so you can see how we tied a little flag at the bottom of this one, and it's actually starting to get a little more enlarged. And then this is several weeks, maybe even a month after, and it's amazing the difference between the one that we hand pollinated here and then the ones that we didn't hand pollinate, and that's these here. So difference in size means difference in number of seed that's in that capsule. This is considered just one capsule here. And in this particular case, I did collect I collect usually just the capsule, but I did look in these other ones and there was absolutely no seed in these whatsoever. So that's why it's critically important for me to go around and do all of this labor intensive hand pollination just to ensure that we get good seed. This is another example again of showing the same plant, put a little string on the one that we hand pollinated, and then sure enough, you can see later in the fall the striking difference between the two here that we hand pollinated versus the ones that we didn't. And I also wanted to talk about, not only are we trying to propagate orchid species, but we're also trying to learn information from existing orchid populations. And we're doing that by doing 2 different studies at existing orchid sites. So we're trying to track long-term individual orchid species, and then we're also trying to track the habitat. So what you're seeing here are images of orchid specific plots. So this, I believe, is at River Edge, and there's a healthy population of the lesser yellow lady slipper. And so this is a 1 square meter plot where we know that the orchids we know that the orchids are here. These are native populations. So here's one right here. Here's another one right here. Certainly this is one here and right here. And so we every year collect information on the location, the height. So the location within this grid system. So we have them measured on an XY coordinate system so we can relocate exactly where we documented the orchid the year before. Measure the height, measure the number of leaves, we measure the width and length of the leaf, we take note on if it flowered and if it set seed, we take note on if there's any herbivory. If it's later in the year, we'll look to make sure that there's a winter bud because the next year's growth is typically right at the base of the plant. We take note on what associated species we see within the 1 square meter plot, and then general information such as hydrology and ground cover. So over time, we're trying to be able to track these populations so that when we do ultimately reintroduce new populations, we'll have sort of a baseline understanding of what the native populations are doing. And we're trying to do this for a number of different orchid species every year. We try and establish several more of these plots. And long term, I'd like volunteers to be able to collect this data. So I'd love volunteers to adopt a plot. And then it's their responsibility every year to go back and collect this information. We're establishing a web map to be able to track this information. So as long as you have an iPhone, or you could even, check out an iPad from River Edge, and then you can actually, you can give you some basic tools like this 1 square meter sample plot. We can give you some measuring tools, and then you can go and collect all the information for me, and then it just gets uploaded automatically into this web map system that we built. So we're trying to make it user friendly for volunteers, but this is yet another way that a volunteer can participate long-term by adopting a plot. And then we're also trying to assess the community as a whole. And so this includes, kind of a standard habitat assessment tool where we run these transects across the community, and then we collect sample plot information. So an orchid may or may not be in that sample plot, but nonetheless, we're trying to collect information on the community, the greater community as a whole. And then just to go through some of the annual tasks that we do every year. So we have the shade house planting, and that's typically in early May. You saw pictures of that from 19 and 2021. I'm not sure if we'll be able to do one this year because this 2022 would have been impacted by the seed that we collected in 2020, because typically the propagation process in a lab is at least a 1.5 year process. So because 2020 was sort of an odd year, we may end up having to skip this year, unfortunately. We're always caring for the orchids in the shade house, and we overwinter them in a couple different ways. Typically they can't, if they're just sitting in pots above the ground, more often than not, they'll freeze. So we have a lot of the orchid seedlings in refrigerators right now, and they'll come out in a couple months. We try and engage the volunteers and then do training. Hand pollination, that's something I primarily do, and I run all over the Midwest hand pollinating. We have this web map, the monitoring that we do, pollination studies. So River Edge is particularly interested in identifying who's pollinating the orchids. So they actually have a great intern program, and they stick interns in front of orchids and they watch for pollinators. Seed collection, that certainly happens in the fall for the orchids that we hand pollinated, but also ones that reliably pollinate on their own. We do propagation. Again, that's always ongoing. Minnesota Landscape Arboretum is our primary propagation partner. So that happens in their labs, unfortunately, sort of out of the view of the volunteers, but they definitely, for volunteers that live near there, they do the bulk of the propagation at the Minnesota Landscape Arboretum's labs. Partner development. So we, not only is River Edge a main partner, but certainly the Nature Conservancy. There's a number of other land trusts in Wisconsin that we're partnering with, the Ridges. So it's a big community partnership. And we're always looking for funding, specifically from grants, to help fund some of this work. And with that, I will take any questions. Maybe I could stop sharing so we could see each other.
Melissa, that is fascinating. And I want to say thank you for the work you do, because you are single-handedly saving orchid plants. And I know that they are hard to propagate. They're rare. Yeah, you should. I hope you do get accolades from time to time for the work you're doing, because I'm sure it's kind of a thankless, labor-intensive job.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. And that's why I said I feel like I'm sort of the champion of this project, because it just takes someone like me who just has a passion to just keep it going sometimes.
Yep. Absolutely. Yep. I do have a question about Stantec. I looked them up a little bit, but I'm just wondering if you could give us a little background on how they're involved in this type of a project or other projects like this.
Yeah, so this is actually a really great segue to something Mary Jane was talking about. So Stantec is a design engineering firm. We do just about everything, and I'm not kidding, that sounds weird, but we're primarily a North American company. So our corporate office is out of Edmonton, Alberta. So we're really a Canadian-based company. We have lots of offices throughout North America, but certainly overseas as well. So we do consider ourselves a global company. I think we're upwards of 22,000 people now.
Wow.
So it's a pretty large company, and it's primarily engineers, architects, but in Wisconsin, it's primarily biologists that work on environmental related projects. So in the world of consulting, it's all about acquisitions. Stantec buys smaller companies, and the company they bought in Wisconsin used to be called Natural Resources Consulting. So we were just a bunch of biologists, and that's still the work that we do. So that includes rare plant surveys, wildlife surveys. We do a lot of ecological restoration. And my role in particular at Stantec, it's sort of morphed a little bit over time. I used to spend a lot of time just doing rare plant surveys, monitoring, but now more recently, I support nonprofits by finding grant money to do really cool work. So this is where, if you guys have a park that you want to improve, I could potentially partner with you guys to help find some grant money. And that's commonly what I do up and down the lakeshore, is find grant money for and this could be, county parks, city parks, land trust owned properties. I keep a staff of about 10 restoration people busy year round just doing restoration projects. And we work with a lot of friends groups and other nonprofits on leading a lot of that work. But where orchids connect with Stantec is Stantec has been really great about supporting their staff. And they have a years ago, they had a research and development grant program. So they actually funded me for 3 consecutive years to develop this orchid project because they realized this is a great networking opportunity. It's just really unique. It connects with our ecological restoration that we do. So they just essentially funded me to continue to do this work, which has been fantastic. And I hope someday that some of the orchids that we're propagating can ultimately go to some of the restoration sites that Stantec's working on. So it's loosely connected to Stantec.
Well, I'm curious about if they're supporting nonprofits and these types of products, how do they make a profit? Well, who are their clients, I guess, that are, they keep the company going?
Yeah, so on a lot of my ecological restoration projects, let me see if I can think of a good example. A lot of the restoration we do is fairly large scale. So it's really, when you think about restoration, there are sites where you can do little things that volunteers can do, but then there's sites where there's a really big lift needed. Maybe it's, 10 plus acres of invasive control and maybe a big prairie installation. That's really best served by having a consultant to come in to do the big lift. And then the volunteers can participate in like a community planting or something. So that's typically how my community-led restoration projects go is we're working on sites that are, 30, 40 acres large. Stantec does the big lift. I find the grant money for Stantec to do the big lift, but then the volunteers can be involved to the extent that they want to be, whether that's, we host a lot of like community planting days. We do a lot of educational tours. So that's where, a community group like Wild Ones could be engaged in a project.
So I'm just thinking about this. I guess I still have the business cap on or financial industry cap on. So I know that with new construction, if a wetland, for example, is disturbed, they may need to build a wetland somewhere else. Is that something Stantec does, consults on, or coordinates?
Yep. So we're involved in the wetland mitigation quite a bit. So not only do we work on private mitigation banks, so that's where like a developer, if they impact wetlands, will need to go and build wetlands elsewhere. Then there's the DNR in lieu fee program, which is also a wetland mitigation program. So that's DNR led, and we work on a number of those sites as well. So we do the design, we do the construction oversight, and then we do the vegetation monitoring and management that's typically required on those projects.
Good. I'm glad to see a follow-up because I've seen a number of projects where wetlands have been artificially established, and it's like there's support the first year or so, and then all of a sudden there's phragmites coming up in the wetland and things like that, and nobody's seems to follow up on that. But anyway, thank you.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Are lady tresses that they kind of spiral around, is that in the orchid family?
Yes, it is.
Okay. And because I have some on my property, are they not too rare, or?
There are a few that are rare, so it depends on which one you have. And what's interesting about that group of orchids is they're one of the easiest to propagate, and they typically like disturbance. So those in particular will come in like a newly graded site. You see them in like mining reclamation sites all the time. So that I just randomly threw some seed out in my backyard, and I start to see them there now. So there are a few that are fairly easy to propagate, and that's one of them.
Okay. And I also, many years ago, I had a yellow lady slipper that I discovered, and I saw it 2 years and then I never saw it again. Is there any chance it's still around, or?
Yeah, that's a hard one. So orchids are known to go dormant, and that's in part why we're doing this Adapt a Plat program, because we really want to understand when they go dormant, how long do they go dormant? So I can answer questions just like that.
Yeah.
Because there really is very few people monitoring long-term. So I would say I wouldn't give up hope But what's unfortunate is just one plant doesn't make a population. And, you know, I'd love to at some point be a resource for someone like you, and so that you could, you know, buy a yellow lady slipper from a nature center or something and be able to kind of increase your population to therefore make it healthier and maybe more sustainable long term.
Yeah.
So
Okay,
that's one of the goals
Cool.
of my
cool.
project.
I'll keep looking, but I think
That's-
probably the deer ate it.
Yeah, if you see it again, fence it.
Okay, yeah, I will. Oh, so when do those usually bloom? I mean, when is it? Because I noticed in some of with the pink ones, it looked like the columbine were up and a couple other things were up. What would
Yeah,
be an
so with the yellow lady slippers, it's usually May.
Okay.
But I've been, you know, in my pollination, my hand pollination efforts, you know, I have to be pretty precise on when I show up to a population. So I've been tracking change over time, and it's just amazing how I'm even 10 years ago, I'm now pollinating certain orchid species easily 2 weeks earlier than I ever did, you know, 10 years ago. So it's amazing how much that changes.
Yeah, wow, cool. Thank you.
Thank you.
Lisa, I got a question.
Yep.
Okay,
Thank
thanks, Melissa. That is a really interesting presentation. I really appreciate that.
Thank you.
Is the hawk moth the only moth or insect that pollinates the orchids?
I've been told the monarch butterfly has been seen on that particular orchid. So if there's other hawks that have that really long tongue, yes, but that's the one that they've primarily sort of correlated with the eastern prairie fringed orchid. So it's hard to know, like for a monarch butterfly, how successful they are. So there's a lot we don't know about the pollination interaction. So, but for the most part, we know that the eastern prairie fringed orchid is not being propagated. And in fact, in Illinois, it's entirely volunteer pollinated. They've got armies of volunteers that run around and hand pollinate that species because the hawk moth isn't really present anymore.
Oh, do orchids reproduce vegetatively too?
Some can, like the rattlesnake orchids are kind of a low growing sort of rhizomatous species. So they will form like root systems and then new plants will pop up. But I would say for the most part, no.
Oh, too bad.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's I think I might even contact River's Edge. Just that seems like a really worthwhile project to get involved with.
Yeah, great.
Well, Jeff, maybe we can work something out with our Wild Ones chapter to, you know, to get involved too.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, let's have another question about just, I guess, propagating indirectly in Door County. And yes, it was the Ridges that I toured and it was amazing, absolutely amazing. But I've rented this Airbnb and they have yellow lady slippers just all over the place. And they were establishing a bit of a yard area and basically mowing them. So I dug some up, and I know I probably am not supposed to do that, but I did because they were just going to get mowed, and tried to replant them. Is that possible to do that? Or do you have to, you know, start new plants with seeds?
It is possible. It's certainly not, you know, I mean, in your case, I'll call that a rescue. So
It's a rescue. Yes.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah, it is certainly possible. I would say, you know, you have to be very particular about where you're going to put it, you know, with respect to, you know, the light that it's getting and the soil that it's in. If you do that, again, make sure you get a really large kind of, you know, sod mat, because those roots can go easily a foot out, and they're very coarse roots, so they don't have really fine roots. And really, when you know, dig up an orchid and you look at their root systems, especially with the lady slippers, they maybe only have like a couple really good fleshy roots. So if you were to dig that up and hit a couple of them, that, you know, it's very likely set the plant back a little bit. So make sure you get a big enough shovel full, and then be very conscious of where you're putting it. But I certainly have lots of rescues in my yard that have been pretty successful.
So how long is that? You had one picture that showed kind of a tuberous looking root, or like a taproot.
Yep.
How big are those, like on yellow lady slippers, for instance?
So I've seen them go upwards of a foot in length. So the
Good.
one I showed for the purple fringed orchid, those historically, from what I've seen, have always been a lot shorter. So that was probably a 6-inch root that you saw on
Still
that
pretty
image.
substantial. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, thank you for this presentation. It's very interesting and your photos were beautiful. I hate to say the non-native ones, when I saw that monkey one, to chuckle.
I know. I wish, it's always, the grass is always greener somewhere else, but you look at them, you're like,
Oh.
wow, wouldn't it be nice to walk around and see some of those in the field?
Well, the yellow lady slippers, I mean, my family, I've done a kind of an annual off and on COVID, blah, 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 pilgrimage to Door County. And we're just surrounded at that time. It's usually the weekend after Memorial Day, when they go from in like the peak to starting to wane during that week. And I attached a couple photos to the newsletter or the email to the chapter, and it was amazing. There was this spider on it that was exactly the same color. When we're talking about how specialized these plants are as far as attracting pollinators, I mean, it was exactly the same color. I didn't even see it until I really got down on the ground, and it was the coolest thing. And then the male came up, and it's like this teeny little black one. And it, when you talk about the pollinators that use those plants, that obviously is, they may not be the best pollinators, but they're reproducing. So the plant is providing, something that they need.
Yeah.
So again, thank you for your work on this project.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. All right, well, I guess that's a wrap. Stay tuned for our March program on jumping worms. Check our website for any updates, and thank you all so much for your interest and for caring about planting native plants and taking care of native plants.